Good afternoon and welcome to Malcontent Theology. I'm Michael Drinkwater. For those of you who haven't been following along, I'm in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And this is.
Oh, this is Christopher Adams up in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Yeah, glad to be
Yeah.
here with y'all.
So, one of the things that Christopher and I were sort of chatting about before we started recording was that next week is Holy Week in the church's observance of sort of liturgical time, which is the week, which is largely sort of known as the week before Easter. Um, but here at Malcontent Theology, Holy Week is a very special time for us because it's the only time in the church year when we really sort of fully and embodied experience and celebrate liturgically. And celebrate's kind of a poor choice of words, but that we really observe fully the death of God, which is a fairly important aspect of how both of us, both Christopher and I, approach our sense of the divine. So
I think celebrate's actually a good word. I think there's something to celebrate, truly and exuberantly celebrate, in the fact that the sort of the central part of our story is that God died. Um, Physically, in time and space, suffered death.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and then it wasn't
Paradoxically,
like,
to celebrate that.
yeah, and the church has sort of coped with that with varying degrees of success over time. One of the very first um, one of the very first heresies was called Docetism, which was this notion that God only seemed to suffer, only seemed to be human, and only seemed to die. And so, the church had been sort of going round and around with this for a little while, but did eventually land on the fact that God experienced death on the cross.
Right.
And Christopher well, why don't you talk about that, Christopher? Your piece that you wrote.
Oh yes. Was that last year, Holy Week? What I think
No, no, no,
so.
no.
No?
I don't think it was that far
Okay.
back. I think it was back in the fall.
Okay. So I wrote a piece about resurrection and the resurrection story and how I approach that story from the lens of it's not really that important to me.
Hmm.
Um, in the sense that for me, where the weight of this story is not that um, God was able to beat back death by bursting from the tomb in Jesus Christ, but that God chose to die, right? That God submitted to the machine of death that we are all caught up in. And for me, that feels more redemptive uh, because we don't see resurrection, right, in the way that the Christian story talks about it, particularly about Jesus. And Paul says, sure, this is the first fruits, uh, but we don't see that, right? So our life, in some ways, is lived in this perpetual Good Friday, Holy Saturday space where death is always this thing looming over us, right? And we want to
Mm-hmm.
suspend our uh, we disavow that we're mortal in all sorts of ways, right? Um, but fundamentally, for me to think about whatever God is, right, whatever that name even signifies, that God died, uh, is much more powerful and redemptive for me where I am spiritually. And I think it speaks to the world in a way, because the world sees so much death, right? The world sees so much suffering. And to be able to say that our God is not a victor who rides in triumphantly on a white horse, on the white horse of resurrection, but God is chiefly found. I think this is scriptural, even, right? As a crucified man. I mean, Paul says,
Right.
"I came to you preaching nothing but Christ crucified." He doesn't say, "I came preaching nothing but Christ risen."
Right. And I think that's a good sort of transition into the fact that um, one of the things that seminarians have to struggle with sort of early on in their formation as they go deeper into their biblical studies formation is sort of how the gospel story came together.
Right.
Um, and the gospel story at its very beginning, and you can sort of take the Gospel of Mark as a microcosm of this. Um, sort of the shorter version of the Gospel of Mark as a microcosm of this was that at the very beginning, Christians were drawn to the teaching of Jesus
Right.
and Jesus' suffering and death. And that's the first part of the gospel narrative to come together, and that the resurrection, doesn't, we don't see references to the resurrection until sometime, according to some biblical scholars, maybe even 30 or 40 years
Right.
after that first part of the gospel comes together. And then the birth narratives we only really see in much later than that.
Right.
And so what really spoke to the very, very first generation of Christians had nothing to do with resurrection. What
Mm-hmm.
spoke to them was what Jesus taught and how Jesus lived and died.
Right.
Um, and um, and the Gospel of Mark is almost, especially if you take it sort of in that shorter version, is almost sort of written as a litmus test in and of itself to say, because it ends with people walking away from the tomb and Jesus is closed in there. Um, and disciples who were being formed to be Christians at the time were supposed to know from what Jesus taught and how he lived his life that Jesus was going to come back. But it wasn't referenced in the original version of Mark's story.
Right.
Um, and and I think that forms an important cornerstone to for our theology at Malcontent Theology, because we're into sort of um, peeling back the layers of church theology to really find what speaks to the suffering soul of this world today.
Right.
Um, and we continually find ourselves drawn to the very, not to the almighty God of the resurrection, and not to, the the all powerful and even the omniscient God, but to the God that suffered on the
Mm-hmm.
cross
Right.
and died.